I'd like to welcome all those in Oxford who are joining us, especially those who are participating in the Common Good project in the Faculty of Law. And I'd also like to welcome those at Georgetown University in Washington, DC. And wherever you are, you're very welcome to these talks. Martin Darcy, SJ, was a celebrated master of Campion Hall from 1933 to 1945. And these memorial lectures were established in his honor to share the research of distinguished Jesuit academics with a wider audience. Darcy lecturers have included John Sobrino, Avery Dulles, and most recently Gustavo Morello, and have touched on different disciplines, theology, philosophy, sociology, and others as well. This year, the title of the 8 lectures is Common Good, Theological, Philosophical, and Political Aspects, and they're offered by the Revd Dr Patrick Riordan, SJ. Patrick is a Jesuit priest and is Senior Fellow in Political Philosophy and Catholic Social Thought at Campion Hall. He has published widely with an emphasis on the common good and Catholic social teaching. So it's difficult to imagine a more qualified guide to the contemporary contested issues around the common good. There'll be time towards the end of our hour together for a question and answer session. So during the talk, please do post your questions in the Q&A section that you'll find at the bottom of your screen. The first lecture of this year's series is entitled Philosophical and Theological Sources of the Common Good. Over to you, Patrick.
Thank you very much, Nick, for that introduction, and welcome also to everyone joining us, wherever you are. Delighted to have you with us. So as Nick has remarked, the title of these Darcy lectures point to important aspects of common goods, philosophical, theological, and political. You might wonder why an important aspect is not mentioned, namely the legal. And that is because, as Nick mentioned, legal aspects are currently being very well treated in the Oxford Common Good project hosted by the Faculty of Law. These Darcy lectures are complementary to those conversations. The selected aspects of common goods will be viewed through 3 lenses: Aristotelian philosophy, Catholic social teaching, and political liberalism. With this last lens, political liberalism, you might suspect that I will be drawing on the philosophy of John Rawls, who has a famous book with that title. John Rawls has effectively set the agenda for my discipline of political philosophy throughout my working life. His theory of justice appeared in 1971 when I was an undergraduate, though at that time studying economics and geography. It still set the agenda 10 years later in 1981 when I was writing my doctorate on the philosophy of justice in Innsbruck. His later writings in the 1990s on political liberalism and the law of peoples were a target of my attention in my books on the common good in 2008 and in 2015. I was stimulated by his thought, but mostly I was critical. Like the Irish policeman, a Garda, giving directions to a tourist lost in the west of Ireland who famously said, "If I were going there, I wouldn't start from here." I had questions about his starting point. I am critical of Rawls, but at the same time, I was not and am not in agreement with many of his better known critics, Michael Sandel among them. More of that shortly and in these lectures. My motivation in these lectures is to present and defend a philosophical and theological account of common good that is consistent with the position espoused by the Catholic Church, but that I fear is in danger of distortion at present. The possibility of distortion arises because of a polemical stance being taken, whether against meritocracy, Michael Sandel, or ethical pluralism, Jonathan Sachs, or liberalism, Patrick Deneen. These authors share one thing in their varied concerns. They invoke the common good as naming an alternative to their targeted opponent. This is a crude summary right now, and I hope the lectures will clarify what is at stake. Right at the beginning, I can formulate a question that will be addressed more fully in the third lecture, namely, is liberalism the enemy? If I am committed to the common good, may I not also be a liberal? As a Catholic, endorsing the Church's position on the common good and common goods, I want to affirm that I am philosophically and politically liberal. Central to my approach is a positive evaluation of liberalism, understood as a tradition of thought about how societies should be governed that is predicated on the centrality of human freedom. And human freedom is a fundamental good, and any form of government that respects and promotes and facilitates human freedom is capable of being a common good. The strategy is not to accuse liberalism of lacking something, but to draw attention to what is already operative in the liberal perspective at its best, its grasp and valuing of what is humanly important. Many of the authors I am reacting to are critical of liberalism as the dominant orthodoxy of political regimes and neoliberalism in economics. I am mostly in agreement with them on the problems they identify, but my difficulties with their critiques are philosophical. Many challenge John Rawls's thought, taking him to be a representative of contemporary liberalism. One such is a fellow Jesuit, William O'Neill, whose 2021 book on reimagining human rights, religion and the common good is critical of Rawls. It is understandable that many see Rawls as a defendant, or worse, a creator of contemporary liberal regimes or neoliberal policies. I think it is a mistake to take his thought as a presentation of the self-understanding of liberalism. Yes, he is a liberal because he values liberty and assumes that people would want their government to protect their liberties. But he has not shaped his country's constitution or system. He has inherited it and attempted to resolve philosophical problems that arise when one considers its difficulties. As I see it, Rawls addresses the very same difficulty that many of his more recent critics face when they consider the actual political and economic situation. Rawls addresses a very American problem, one we see arising in a fresh way in 2021 with a new president. The United States of America is a very divided society. Democrats and Republicans seem poles apart on so many issues. They seem to take opposed stances on many practical matters, but what is more, they can mobilize sophisticated philosophical theories to support their practical interests. How does one find common ground in this situation, where even the common ground of philosophical reason is contested territory, as MacIntyre has so well documented? Rawls should be understood as seeing the same divisiveness that the late Jonathan Sacks so eloquently describes in his book, Morality, and attempts to find common ground with his approach. Rawls invites partisan listeners and readers to attempt to step back from their practical and theoretical commitments and to consider how a social and political order could be constructed if no one were in a position to insist on his or her demands. The hypothetical construct of a theory of justice and the follow-up political liberalism have been roundly and properly critiqued. But his basic attempt is to find the common ground in a furiously contested political context. William O'Neill is attempting something similar. The long-running dispute between so-called liberalism and communitarianism, largely instigated by Michael Sandel's attack on the unencumbered individual posited in Rawls's hypothetical contract in a theory of justice, finally ran out of steam. Many of those labeled as communitarians, such as Alistair MacIntyre, refused the label. The thing in common on that side of the debate was their opponent, Rawls, and his account of the human chooser in the hypothetical original position. but it was not intended to be a description of the human person, nor a phenomenology of choice, nor an ontology. I would want to defend Rawls and other liberal thinkers, not in terms of what they have achieved, but in terms of what they have tried to do. And I will want to make the case that what they have tried to do is very much in the cause of common goods. The question posed is how the Catholic tradition of understanding political reality in terms of common goods might be compatible with a political liberalism. This is a challenge that must be met if a liberal Catholic voice is to be maintained and upheld against the tendency to resort to more right-wing conservatism as the only defensible position for a Catholic citizen. A plausible, defensible, and attractive account of a politics of the common good must be offered to meet the interest of the many people who are attracted by the distinctiveness and clarity and seeming moral purity of the position embraced by the critics. This is what I am attempting in these lectures. As I see it, the issue, the challenge to Christians in a liberal democracy is to hold in tension the following three realities. First, our faith conviction that all humans have an ultimate common good or highest good, an ultimate end, and that is God, and the beatitude of life in God in the resurrection. Second, the fact that the members of our political community do not all, A, accept that there is or even could be a common ultimate purpose, or B, if we do think there is a common purpose, that we don't all agree on what it is, or C, if we do agree what it is, that we agree on its implications for practical life. And third, in the context of this plurality, we face the challenge to make and conduct a common life, seeking peace, prosperity, and justice according to law. So in the rest of this lecture, I want to explore some of the sources of the notion of common good, philosophical, drawing on the Greek philosopher Aristotle, and theological, drawing on the Second Vatican Council's pastoral constitution, Gaudium et Spes. My topic is the goods that are, or could be, or should be common. Common to you and me, common to all those actually or potentially viewing and listening, common to all of humankind. Common to all beings beyond that, considering all beings as creatures, perhaps common to creator and creature. Your ears prick up at the mention of creator, perhaps. Will these lectures be theological or philosophical? Will they presuppose faith in the creator? My intention is to speak both philosophically and theologically, but when speaking theologically, I will not be assuming that my listeners have faith, that they share my Christian worldview. However, I will assume goodwill on their part and the willingness to give a charitable interpretation of what is said. I will not expect them or you to agree with my position. My hope is to explain it so that listeners and readers can understand the arguments that are made and can determine for themselves the extent to which they are persuaded by them. Philosophically, I will draw on Aristotle and many others who have learned from him. Aristotle is the outstanding philosopher of ethics and politics, whose questions and distinctions remain provocative and fruitful, almost 2.5 millennia since they were first voiced. If I mention Aristotle, you will not be surprised if Plato before him and Aquinas after him also get a mention. Aristotle's thought is my resource for reflecting on our contemporary experience. Perhaps you'll be surprised that Augustine is not immediately listed as a source. Admittedly, the burgeoning literature on political Augustinianism makes him an interesting figure for this topic. And I hope in a later lecture to make sense of my reasons why I do not think it helpful to begin with his rich theological thought. Theologically, I draw on Gaudium et Spes, the pastoral constitution on the church in the world of today, the influential declaration by the bishops of the Catholic Church assembled at the Second Vatican Council in the 1960s. The 1960s, 60 years ago. Subsequent papal encyclicals and declarations by bishops' conferences are also among my resources when speaking about common goods. So I'm placing my cards on the table right at the beginning, acknowledging my standpoint and my sources. I hope to be transparent on these, and will have to return to this more personal acknowledgement at various points as my assumptions and commitments shape what I say. So why Aristotle? Alistair MacIntyre credits Aristotle with articulating the natural orientation of human reason, undistorted by ideological positions. This is admittedly a piece of speculation. I can endorse it to the extent that I seek a way of speaking about our experience without having to use the jargon or the constructs of some theory or other. Aristotle believes that we can learn something about reality by attending to the way we talk about it. And his analysis of the four causes is a case in point. He attended to the way the term cause was used in ordinary speech. Aristotle's approach to in looking at our ordinary spontaneous way of speaking as disclosing the structure of reality is attractive for equipping citizens in democratic polities for the exercise of their responsibilities. And the mention of responsibilities provides another indication why Aristotle is a useful guide. In both his ethics and politics, he challenges his students to take a stance on questions that would affect how they live and how they shape their lives. The classification of types of constitution in the politics, for instance, is framed by the question of how each one would wish to live. An analysis of tyranny is offered, but not in the manner of a distanced, neutral observer. Instead, the question is posed whether one would prefer to live under a tyrannical regime or in some other. The theoretical analysis, then, is for the sake of an existential, practical choice. Similarly, the question in the ethics about the ultimate purpose of life is raised to help young Athenian men choose for themselves how they would wish to live, whether trapped by illusory promises of satisfaction or critically aware of the limitations of what popularly passes for success in life. The mention of young Athenian men warns us that Aristotle's thought is conditioned by his time and place. We have to be aware of his limitations and be critical of the views he held, and in this we can sometimes rely on turning his own critical thought against himself. Aristotle's empiricism, his attention to spontaneous speech, and his framing of study in a wider practical context makes him useful for my approach to understanding common goods. An incidental benefit is that this pre-Christian philosopher writes about politics in terms of common goods, and so provides support in answering those who would dismiss talk of common good as purely of Catholic interest, so a sectarian concept. The notion of common good is not theological in origin, but philosophical, introduced by Aristotle in his Politics. As Aristotle sees it, human action is always for some good, or something that is perceived to be good. The maker of flutes sees something worthwhile in the product in enabling good and beautiful music and allowing the excellence of the performer to appear. Flute maker and flute player cooperate. They act together for a good in common. Note here that the understanding of cooperation as acting together is not to imply at the same time or in the same place. The maker of the instrument must complete her task before the musician can perform. And yet the performance cannot take place unless there is an available instrument. Among the goods at stake in their activity is their own excellence and flourishing, even if they don't think about this. An excellent instrument and an excellent performance are complemented by the excellence of the flute maker and the well-being of the musician. Here we have a distinction between two meanings of the good that are related in Aristotle's view. The practical sense as that objective of action that is pursued because considered good, and on the other hand, the good of the agent who is fulfilled and perfected in the activity of pursuing such goods. This is achieved without it being the direct intention of the agent. Aristotle is aware that there are many instances of cooperation and many organizations and institutions facilitating collaboration, whether business, sporting, cultural, or religious, each of which has its distinctive activities oriented to their various purposes, constituting their common goods. There are as many common goods as there are forms of cooperation. He writes in the Ethics, I quote, "Since there are many actions, arts, and sciences, it follows that their ends are many too. The end of medical science is health, of military science, victory, of economic science, wealth." End of quotation. For Aristotle, there is always a valid question whether the good pursued in collaboration is a genuine good, and whether it is truly for their good, that is, that its achievement would accomplish their excellence or perfection. Aristotle always allows for the possibility that people can be mistaken about their good in both senses, both what is worth pursuing and what is good for them. His basic line is that while all action is for some good or perceived good, so all cooperation is for the sake of a good in common. Common good is not only or primarily designated in the singular as the common good. He introduces the singular with definite article when discussing the good for the sake of which the political community cooperates. Against the background of the Greek city-states such as Athens, he considers that the highest possible good of cooperation, which best perfects the collaborators, is the good achieved in politics. As the city is taken to represent the highest possible form of cooperation, so its good is taken to be the highest possible good. In other words, the best possible achievement for humans, the most fulfilling accomplishments, the best they can be and become, is as engaged citizens participating in the life of their city. That's his view. We may not want to follow him in drawing this conclusion, and Christians will not, but his path to it is interesting. In his analysis of any matter, Aristotle takes his standard from the best case, whether an object of botany or zoology, or of ethics or politics. He explains that the nature of any kind of thing is to be read from its completion or maturity, that stage of its existence when it has achieved what it is capable of being. So the seed or the sprouting plant are to be understood in terms of what they are on their way to becoming. Similarly, with forms of cooperation. In the development of forms of human cooperation, the political is understood as that which can be the end of a process, a stage of self-sufficiency at which nothing is lacking, which might yet complete the development. In his short genealogy at the beginning of the Politics, he describes a process of development of forms of human collaboration for common advantage, from the partnership of pairs, male and female, master and servant, to the formation of households, the emergence of villages and associations of villages. At every level, the collaboration is for the sake of something worthwhile. The polis, the city, emerges when the collaboration is sufficiently sophisticated to provide the association with everything it needs to achieve the good life. There is nothing more to wish for. However, the household is not presented here as merely a stage in the evolution of the polis, as the caterpillar is a stage in the life cycle of the butterfly. He stresses this when considering the relationship between them. He makes the point in terms of the distinction between life itself and the good life. The household nurtures life on a daily and generational basis. The city pursues the good life, The good life, the notion he uses for that form of cooperation in which nothing is lacking. So the good life realized in politics is contrasted with life itself, which is secured in the household. There is an important parallel distinction here between necessity, the satisfaction of need on the one hand, and liberty, freedom from necessity on the other. Aristotle identifies the common good in politics as the good life. In trying to say what exactly constitutes the good life, Aristotle relies on a contrast with alternative views of politics. The political association is more than a set of non-aggression pacts. It is more than a mutual guarantee of rights, and it is more than a set of contracts for the exchange of goods and services, all possible forms of association recognized in his day. But what is that more? Aristotle does not explain this in detail. However, he does provide some pointers which allow us to understand in outline what he means. He points out that communities based on non-aggression or mutual benefit in trade are not interested in fostering the character and virtue or well-being of the citizens of partner cities. But in a mature political community, the legislators, in pursuing the common good, are primarily concerned about the development of citizens' characters, and they would make laws with the purpose of training citizens in virtue. What does he mean by virtue? By virtue, Aristotle means the capacity for noble actions, for excellence in the performance of distinctive human activities, among which he lists the activities of friendship and the doing of justice as a member of the citizen body. The notion of the good life is constructed by a process of expansion of the conception of the human good. Always more than points beyond what spontaneously comes to mind in specifying the purpose of social cooperation, wealth, security, and now an additional dimension of human well-being in terms of character and virtue, so that friendship, justice, and wisdom in ruling are realized. The good life, therefore, as the common good, must be read as a heuristic, naming something aimed at that is not yet fully comprehended because not yet realized. Aristotle had surveyed the constitutions known in his world, and he observed that the constitution of every city encapsulated some conception of the good, and therefore of the good life. The basis for political community, he believes, is the sharing of a view of what is good and worthwhile, what is noble and just, and what is lawful. Without agreement on such fundamentals, an association of people would not constitute a political community. Just as we could hardly imagine a tennis club without a commitment by its members to the sport of tennis, so also he thought we could not conceive of a polis without agreement among its citizens about the shared vision of the human good. Harmony and agreement are at the heart of his account of the common good. Still, Aristotle conceded that there are many possible conceptions of the good life, each with its own characteristic form of constitution and a corresponding criterion of justice. So, for instance, in oligarchy, the unifying vision regards the good life as a life devoted to the pursuit and enjoyment of wealth. In a city like Sparta, renowned for its military prowess, the characteristic virtues to be fostered in the citizenry are military virtues. Aristotle inquires of any constitution whether rule is exercised for the common good, the good of all, or only for the good of the rulers. This allows him to distinguish between good and bad extremes. Rule by one for the common good is termed monarchy. Rule by one in the interest of the ruler only is tyranny. Aristotle's objection to democracy, as he understands the term, is that it is ruled by the many, the majority, in their own interests and not in the interests of all. That concern should have resonances for us, the majority using their power for their own benefit and not for the good of the whole country, the whole community. The idea in democracy that the winner takes all. It's possible to formulate two criteria for the common good based on Aristotle's own distinctions. If the purpose of the political community is to be a common good, then it could only be such if it does not systematically exclude any individual or any group of persons from a fair share in the good for the sake of which they cooperate. This is the first criterion, modeled on Aristotle's concern that rule be for the good of all and not merely for the good of the rulers, whether one, few, or many. And if the ultimate purpose is to be a common good, then it could only be complete if it does not systematically exclude or denigrate any genuine dimension of the human good. This second criterion is modeled on Aristotle's evaluation of different constitutions in terms of their conceptions of human good, whether expansive or constricted. He relied on the phrase translated as always more than to identify the conception of the human good which would be satisfactory and comprehensive without being able to say exactly what it is. It is something striven for in political life. It would be more than a mutual guarantee of rights or a set of non-aggression pacts or treaties to exchange goods and services. Pointing beyond suggests a heuristic understanding of the common good, the good life. That is, it names something that is only vaguely known, which has yet to be fully discovered, but which would have to meet the two criteria. So now let us take an imaginative leap over millennia from the Athens of Aristotle to the Church of the 20th century. In both contexts, we find mention of common goods. Could they possibly be speaking and writing about the same reality? Alistair MacIntyre warns against assuming that the same term in use in different contexts carries the same meaning. We will have to investigate. When the Catholic Church in the mid-20th century writes and speaks of the common good, it does not refer to an ultimate or a highest good, as one might expect from Aristotle's coining of the phrase when discussing politics. Instead, the Church focuses on means and conditions. For the context of the collaborative shaping of common life, the authoritative instances in the Church concentrate on the appropriate means for a decent human life, and not on the ultimate ends of human life. This is a very important contrast and relevant for clarifying many misunderstandings. Of course, the Church does have a vision of the ultimate and the highest good. She affirms her responsibility to preach the gospel with a doctrine that points towards an ultimate end. But for this purpose, she does not any longer use the language of common goods. Pope John XXIII's encyclical letter Mater et Magistra, Mother and Teacher, in 1961, writes of the common good to refer to the conditions and resources that would facilitate the achievement of a decent human life. This usage is taken over by Gaudium et Spes, the Pastoral Constitution on the Church and the World of Today, in 1965. I quote, "The common good embraces the sum total of all those conditions of social life which enable individuals, families, and organizations to achieve complete and effective fulfillment." End of quotation. The set of conditions for human fulfillment, rather than the nature of human fulfillment itself, is the focus. The full set of conditions which would enable persons and communities to flourish is what the Council sees as the common project of humankind. This extends across the full range of human activities and human aspirations. No list, however long, would be exhaustive. And that is not just because it is hard to think of everything. It is also because human ingenuity is constantly creating new possibilities and so new conditions, coming up with new fields of endeavor, new areas of scientific exploration, and new possibilities of medical and surgical intervention and care. Accordingly, the complete set of conditions for human flourishing, including economic, social, cultural, legal, political, international, and global, reveal how complex the challenge is. But in each of these areas, we can expect lively debate about what is needed, what needs to be done. So why this concentration on the conditions for human well-being? In the mid-20th century, the Church saw the need to move from a defensive and fearful stance to a more positive engagement with the world. The Council wanted to address all men and women, and not just believers in Christ or in God, but everyone, including atheists. Hence the recognition that while all of these addressees will not share the same ultimate vision, they might nonetheless be able to agree on what conditions and resources would help people achieve their vision of the good life. Here we see the Council's opening to the world, the desire to have a basis for cooperation with people of goodwill who might not share in the Church's ultimate convictions, but still can be partners in working for human development. One such debate about human development concerns workers. Since the engagement of Pope Leo XIII with the phenomenon of modern capitalist economic systems in Rerum Novarum in 1891, the popes have repeated the insistence that human work not be treated just as a factor of production which has a cost which employers are constantly motivated to minimize. Culminating in the letter of Pope John Paul II, explicitly devoted to the topic of work, Laborem Exercens, on human work, in 1981, the popes have maintained a constant insistence that work and the status of the worker is at the heart of the social question. Concern for workers demands solidarity. Pope John Paul II wrote in his encyclical letter on social concern in 1987 that solidarity, I quote, is not a feeling of vague compassion or shallow distress at the misfortunes of so many people, both near and far. On the contrary, it is a firm and persevering determination to commit oneself to the common good, that is to say, to the good of all and of each individual, because we are all really responsible for all. End of quotation. John Paul II is clear about the need on the part of the Church and all Christians for a firm commitment to changing the circumstances which deprive people of their humanity and deny them the prospect of a decent life. In the Catholic tradition of upholding the common good, the focus can be directly on those groups which are vulnerable to exploitation or discrimination. Hence the adoption of the language of preferential option for the poor. The Church wants to place herself at the side of those who are victims, who suffer, who bear a disproportionate burden, either as a result of natural catastrophe or human irresponsibility. Solidarity is paired with another important principle related to the common good, namely subsidiarity. The principle of subsidiarity insists that assistance motivated by solidarity should not replace the efforts of recipients themselves to address their problems and find solutions. It entails a willingness to help, with an expectation that those being helped take responsibility to find and implement their own solutions to their problems. In a hierarchically structured governance system, the principle of subsidiarity requires that the higher level authorities assist, but do not replace those operating on the ground. This is opposed to all centralizing tendencies which are inclined to draw all power to the center of institutions or organizations, depriving the grassroots of opportunities to manage their own affairs. Of course, this should also apply to the Church itself. So we can understand what Pope Francis is now trying to do with his emphasis on synodality as the implementation of this vision of subsidiarity. But it was also Pope Benedict's vision. In his 2009 encyclical letter, Love in Truth, Caritas in Veritate, Pope Benedict writes, I quote, "The principle of subsidiarity must remain closely linked to the principle of solidarity and vice versa, since the former without the latter gives way to social privatism, while the latter without the former gives way to paternalist social assistance that is demeaning to those in need." End of quotation. By social privatism, Benedict means the attitude that everyone should be left alone to mind their own business. And by its opposite, paternalistic social assistance, he means the paternalistic attitude of acting on the assumption that one knows what is best for others. This statement was made originally in the context of reflection on international development aid. There are two important values which are to be respected, and disregard of one in favor of the other can lead to distorting or objectionable outcomes. And so now I move on to my conclusion. I've surveyed Aristotle, my philosophical source, and the Vatican Council's pastoral constitution for my theological source. And now I want to draw attention briefly to similarities and differences between them. First, the differences. Aristotle stresses the hierarchy, the ultimacy and primacy of the good life, the highest good, as the common good of the highest form of cooperation, namely politics. Catholic social thought looks not at the ultimate end, but at the means and conditions for the pursuit of human fulfillment, both individual and communal. Where Aristotle is all-encompassing in his approach, the Church's perspective is confined to what can be common ground. And then the similarities. Both are programmatic rather than substantive in their specification of common goods. I use the label heuristic to qualify the kind of concept that is generated. Both rely on operative criteria for determining whether any particular instance is in fact a common good. And the criteria they generate exhibit remarkable parallels. Aristotle's no person or group excluded parallels the Church's understanding of solidarity. Aristotle's no dimension of human good excluded parallels the principle of subsidiarity. With Aristotle, we can understand cooperation in terms of goods in common. We can understand also why he might imagine the highest possible good in common that would be the purpose of the most developed form of human cooperation. A heuristic concept or ideal could name the goal of that cooperation that lacked nothing, that was completely self-sufficient. With the Catholic sources, we can appreciate the reluctance to speak in terms of such an ideal in a context in which people are divided on ultimate goods and on the purpose of human existence. The Church authorities seek common ground with those who are of a different persuasion about ultimate ends, so that a basis for cooperation for the sake of humanity can be found. The Church at the Vatican Council accepted the factual reality of pluralism and diversity. And so I return to that description of the problem I posited at the beginning. People of faith, including those of us from the Catholic tradition, have to do what all citizens in liberal democracies must do, namely hold in tension the three realities. First, our vision of the ultimate good. In the case of us Christians, our faith conviction that all humans have an ultimate common good, or highest good, who is God, and the beatitude of life in God in the resurrection. So we have to hold on to our vision of the ultimate good. But secondly, we have to face the fact that in practice, we as members of political communities do not all accept that there is or even could be a common ultimate purpose, Or B, if we do think there is a common purpose, that we all agree on what it is. Or C, if we do agree what it is, that we agree on its implications for practical life. And then thirdly, we must face the challenge in the context of this plurality to make a common life, seeking peace and prosperity and justice according to law. This is a difficult and complex stance to manage, and it is not well served by sloganeering. The task of this project is to rescue Christians and others of faith from simplistic slogans relying on communitarianism or common good when considering how to read the signs of the times and how to analyze what is going on in cultural and political life. Of course, this will always be disputed terrain, and I don't expect to find complete agreement. But I hope in these lectures to provide some resources so that citizens who wish to invoke the Catholic intellectual tradition will have sophisticated tools at their disposal and won't be easily dismissed as foolish or naive. But those resources must be intelligible and accessible to other citizens also. Next week, we'll return to Aristotle and look more closely at what it is he might be able to offer us. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Patrick, for that exploration of the philosophical and theological sources of the common good. We now have some time for some questions, so please do continue to post your questions into the Q&A. We'll begin with a question from Anastasia. Anastasia asks, how are the common interests identified in the modern world that is very diverse, and how can it be achieved? And I take it that Anastasia's touching on one of the central issues in a common good approach, which is also a politically liberal approach, which is how can you get sufficient substantive agreement on the common good that Aristotle recognized was necessary for that kind of cooperation. So I don't know what your response would be to that, Patrick.
I think my point has been to make clear that when we talk about the common good, we are not in a position to invoke some content, some substantive content from which we can derive applications to solve concrete difficulties. So for instance, take any field of human endeavor, such as education. So what is it we want to achieve in our universities or in our schools, primary or secondary? There are disagreements about what is the best philosophical approach to education, what would be the best curriculum, what would be the best time in a student's life to encourage them to specialize, how broad should the curriculum be at second level, or is second level already appropriate as a stage for specialization? There can be reasonable disagreement between concerned professionals and parents and citizens on all of those questions. The point about common good as heuristic is to say, look, we engage with one another at facing the fact that we don't all agree, but with an attempt to find common ground and to find a way of, because we must do it. You can't wait until the questions are all answered and the solution is found before beginning a process of education. The children are present now and they must be at school now and cared for now. But we can learn from our experience and learn from our mistakes and adapt and change. So the same approach then will apply in all areas, whether it's in science and in the economy and politics, in healthcare.
Okay, thank you for that answer, Patrick. Another question on a similar line, it's a fairly long question, but perhaps if I can try and summarize it. Tapak is interested in the question of what constitutes flourishing in human life. And he says we can't escape the substantive discussion of what is a human person, her nature, her ultimate ends, if we are to articulate the concept of the common good. He seems to acknowledge the point that you were making, that it's only in cooperation that we come to articulate what those common goods are. but he doesn't think we can escape those more metaphysically sounding questions, if you like. What is the human person? What is human nature? And what does it mean to flourish as a human being? So how would you respond to that, Patrick?
I agree completely. I agree completely. But I also think that we have to distinguish between the different fora in which these conversations take place. And this is one of the reasons why I will espouse liberalism, or a form of liberalism, as my preferred political philosophy. I don't want my state to impose on me its vision of human flourishing or its account of the human good. So this is a discussion we'll be having later in the series, especially when I consider the third lecture on liberalism, because there are certain questions that have to be kept alive. The questions about human dignity, about the ultimate purpose of life. These will be addressed in appropriate fora in civil society, whether it is in universities, in churches, in libraries, in publication, in sophisticated media, rather than in parliaments or Congress. The appropriate topic for debate in a parliament or in Congress will be on finding what are the appropriate instruments and resources and means to enable people to live well, to live decently. But that presupposes that we can come to some agreement on what those conditions and purposes are. And it seems straightforward enough to be able to point to the fact that in modern society, you can only do well if you're literate, if you've had sufficient education to be able to take part in processes of democratic politics, of following news stories, of engaging in public debate, and so on. So it's not only that people need to be fed, but they need to have a level of cultural development and of education to be able to function as citizens, even being in need, perhaps, to be able to benefit from social welfare provisions that are put in place. That's one of the fascinating things in the sociological study of welfare states, is how, in fact, it was middle-class people who most benefited because they were most resourced to be in a position to know what their rights were and could benefit from supports that were made available to them. So that's just an example to illustrate the way in which the conditions for doing well, for living a decent human life, we can identify, even if we're not able as yet to say that we all agree on what the ultimate vision of human flourishing will be. On the topic of human nature, again, I agree on that concern, but I do think it is always helpful to remember that the term nature, we have to consider also as a heuristic. It's a label naming something that we want to discover. We're trying to find out what it is to be human. What is the human? What is it that the human is capable of? What are its highest ambitions and goals and ideals? And that is always more than what has already been achieved. But we have to be able to speak of nature as a heuristic.
Okay, thanks for that answer. Now we're going to look at a question from Will Trago, and he's addressing a related question to do with authority. And you mentioned at the beginning the worry that some forms of the common good approach tend towards an authoritarianism. He asks, in the case of disagreement, who and under which relevant frameworks or authority gets to choose whether something's part of the common good or not? So I think an important question, again, for someone attempting to hold together the politically liberal tradition and common good tradition.
I'll invoke here a formulation used by Eric Voegelin in writing about politics, political philosophy. Any society needs to articulate itself for action in the public space, for action in history. How does a society articulate itself for action? Well, by creating some structures, institutions, some practices, so that it can act together as a society. And that always will involve creating instances of authority. We're familiar with that. We're familiar with what those authorities are. We also are familiar with the history of how they can be abusive, how they can fail, how they can undermine the very purpose for which they are needed, which is to direct people towards a decent existence and secure them in having a decent existence. So the question asks about authority. Any society will need institutions that are authoritative. We're familiar with them in our democratic systems, whereby we have legislatures and we have executive officers and we have courts with the officers of the courts. We have in universities, the officers of the university in their various roles, who also have appropriate authority. What we're concerned about perhaps is always that the authority be exercised according to roles that are defined by law, so that there's a transparency about the extent of the authority's power and the limitations by which it must to which it must conform. So I think we'd have to make the question a lot more concrete and specific. So if we think in terms of the COVID pandemic and the attempts by government to find ways of regulating behavior to minimize the destructive force of the pandemic, and various decisions are made about lockdown, about who may do what, where, about whether masks are to be worn. And we can see that there are people who disagree, who don't think that the decisions that are taken by the authorities are correct. What are we to do? In such a situation, it seems to me that while it might be the case that there are disputes that can be held and disagreements that can be conducted, action must be taken. And it is important that there be officers in place and institutions in place that take the decision and implement those decisions. And I don't have any qualms about that, even if it is also likely that there will at times be mistakes made. Being human is to be fallible, and it is always likely that mistakes will be made. But the person who never made any mistake never made anything. Our societies have to articulate themselves for action, and that requires institutions and authorities. I hope that points in some direction anyway as to how a very major question needs to be answered.
Okay, thank you very much, Patrick, and thank you to all of you for attending. Thanks for all the questions. We had some questions on other very pertinent topics, on education, for example, on the family and so on, and we haven't had time to explore those today, but we have the series will continue next week, so hopefully we'll get a chance to explore those issues. So on behalf of Campion Hall and our partners, Georgetown University Press, thank you to all of you for joining us this evening or afternoon, wherever you are. Please remember to register for next week's lecture at the same time, same day, for the second lecture in the Martin Darcy Memorial Lectures 2021, entitled Reconstructing Aristotle's Political Philosophy. Have a very good evening.
Thank you, and bye-bye.